Blog Talk Radio.
Well, here we go, ladies and gentlemen, across the country as we move the Cleveland Indians / Guardians out of the way right now. The Browns will be in the backdrop along with the Cavaliers. Ohio State football down. If you go down Columbus a little ways, maybe you'll hit Cincinnati and you'll rekindle the memories of the Joe Morgan celebration this past Sunday. But this is center stage right now, front, back, sideways, whatever. It's the American Sports History Podcast, live from Cleveland, Ohio, hosted by my good friend, a mentor, a brother, Peter Ray. Yours truly, Mark Mancini, producing it, 347-205-9631. You can catch the archive version on blogtalkradio.com/Mancini Sports. Podcast platforms where you subscribe to, powered now by Mancini Media. So without further ado, as we lay down the red carpet, put the podium in its place, and hand off the mic, first of all, my good friend Peter, how are you? Second of all, how can people get a hold of you? And third, there's another legend coming on your show tonight, my brother.
Well, hi, Mark. I'm doing very well. I have a YouTube channel. It's my name, Peter J. Ray, R-E-A, and you're absolutely right about tonight's guest. He's from Burlington, Vermont, lives in Northfield, Vermont. He's a history instructor at Norwich University, site manager and columnist for Down the Drive at SB Nation, and he wrote, one of my favorite people are authors of books because I love reading books, history books, and also and sports books. I admire so much the people who take the time to focus on a topic and produce books for people to read. And tonight's guest is the author of Loserville, Atlanta Sports History. It just came out I think it's coming out, or it's a new book. Welcome to the show, Mr. Clayton Trutor.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, Loserville, How Professional Sports Remade Atlanta, and How Atlanta Remade Professional Sports. It's available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all your well-known online book retailers, and it officially comes out early in 2022.
Right. I've got, before I forget, on your Facebook page, you've got a wonderful photograph of Darrell Evans, Henry Aaron, and Davey Johnson, the only three guys in MLB, only three teammates in 1 year, the same year, to hit 40 home runs. Darrell Evans, who won a World Series with Detroit in '84, Henry Aaron, the home run king, and Davey Johnson, who was part of the legendary Baltimore Orioles infield, and later won a World Series as the New York Mets manager. Do you have any thoughts on those three fellows?
Well, to me, that 1973 Braves team with the three guys with the 40 home runs is probably about the most interesting losing team of all time. Having that much power on the team, having a 20-game winner in Necro. I mean, there aren't that many bad teams that have that many interesting dynamics going on in it. So I find it, because Atlanta in this time period has many teams that aren't particularly strong, that doesn't mean that their teams weren't interesting. That 73 Braves team with that trio is certainly an example of that.
Now, Clayton, you're from Vermont. How did you end up writing a book on Atlanta sports history?
When I was in graduate school, my training is in U.S. cultural and U.S. urban history, and I wanted a topic that combined American popular culture with the history of cities. And I wanted to write about the history of professional sports franchise relocations. In a broad sense initially, what impact did it have on American cities? But as I got talking with my advisor, she said that's probably a little bit more than you want to bite off. Pick a city to serve as your case study. And I thought about picking either a city that had been negatively impacted by franchise relocations and league expansions, or one that had benefited as a result of it. I actually almost wrote about Cleveland, because Cleveland was both fighting to keep its teams through financing different stadiums, whether it's Jacobs Field, whether it's the Q, whether it's the Brown Stadium. They certainly lost the Browns. They lost the Barons as well. But I ended up picking Atlanta because as I worked on the project, I realized that Atlanta in many ways had invented the economics of modern sports. I see my book in some ways as being an origin story for the modern sports business, because Atlanta's city leaders, their political leaders, their corporate leaders in the 1960s make it priority one to make their city a major league town. There were no pro sports teams in Atlanta, major pro sports teams in Atlanta in 1965. By 1972, they have teams in all 4 major professional leagues. And the city of Atlanta had been always very good at luring capital, luring investment from places in the north. In many ways, they just took the model they had for luring through subsidies, through presenting themselves as a business-friendly environment. They used the same methods they would to lure a factory or lure a branch plant of a large corporation to bring in big league sports. And the city built on its own dime Atlanta Fulton County Stadium and helped finance the building of the Omni Arena, which served as the home of the Hawks of the NBA and the Flames of the National Hockey League. So I picked Atlanta because in many ways it's the beginning point of the modern sports business. So many other cities, particularly in the Sun Belt, modeled their approach to getting pro sports on what Atlanta did, whether it's San Diego or Tampa or to some extent Houston or Phoenix. And conversely, cities in the urban north that were fighting to defend their teams from cities in the south and southwest that were trying to lure them, they had to invest in stadiums too, in the way Cleveland did, to protect its teams from investors in other cities. So that's essentially the concept for the story, where it comes from, and the beginning point for my book.
We have Don from Warren, Ohio, listening. He's mentioned the Chop Talk versus the Tribe. Now, let's, when I saw the title of your book, I was thinking, Cleveland, Atlanta '95 World Series, and and I know that they had lost the World Series in '91 and '92, and I remember after they won in '95, they had John Smoltz interviewed, and he said, it's either you're champ or chumps, and I don't understand that, because they said, oh, you guys, you're a loser because you lost the World Series, and then they lost the tough '96 series, and then got swept in '99, and that haven't been back since. Now, the title of your book is Loserville. Why do you have that title?
Well, it's not really referring to the last couple of decades in which many of Atlanta's teams have been very successful, whether it's the Braves. Obviously, the Hawks had a very good season. I don't really follow Major League Soccer that much, but obviously Atlanta United has been very successful and won a championship in that league, and the Falcons came very close to winning the Super Bowl. The title refers more to the 1960s and 1970s, that the city had all these grand hopes for bringing in pro sports, that they would serve as a source of prestige for the city, that they would serve as a source of unity, but the teams struggled both in the box office and in the standings. And the title Loserville comes from a 2-part series in the Atlanta Constitution in 1975. The editor at the time was a guy named Louis Grizzard, who had a 2-part front page series called Loserville, detailing Atlanta's failures over its first decade in the major professional leagues to build winning teams. So it's, as much as anything, it's riffing on that particular moment in Atlanta's history. There have obviously been ups and downs in Atlanta sports since then. It's, as much as anything, trying to capture that particular moment that, to a great extent, is the focus of the book.
Well, it sounds like you're getting into, or you got into the idea of teams. There's basically 30 pro teams in each of the 3 leagues, or 4 leagues rather, and then there's these competition, so, and then everyone's, to be honest, back in the 70s, there was all this talk about the Indians leaving, and they're still here, and it comes up, so, and you look at guys like Al Davis moving the Raiders to L.A., back to Oakland, now to Las Vegas, and so it sounds, that is an interesting topic, and I was, historically, it's shocking to see that the Milwaukee Braves moved to Atlanta after they had tremendous success early on in Milwaukee, and then they're in Atlanta. It's like, what the heck happened here? So that is it's a fascinating topic that you're getting into, this whole issue of the competition among cities for these 30 teams in each sport.
Well, with the Milwaukee Braves, I can give you a one-word answer that I cover in about 5 chapters. The answer is ownership. They had a new group of owners who came in who were known as the Rover Boys. They tended to be the scions of wealthy families from the Chicago area, and they just wanted to own a big league baseball team. And things weren't working out financially quite as they expected, as the Braves had fallen back a little bit in the standings from where they were in the late 50s when they were, Bushville, when they had beat the Yankees in the World Series. And they sought out greener pastures elsewhere. And nothing looks greener than Atlanta, which was this booming city, which had just, in terms of its metropolitan population, reached 1 million people, and was the axis of a media market that involved 7 or 8 states all of a sudden, none of whom had pro sports teams. There was pro sports in Washington, D.C. There were starting to be some in Texas, but the entire Southeast was pretty open. And they looked at that and thought, what a juicy market. And they received a very juicy offer from the television stations down there and radio networks to move there. And that's essentially what led, and as well as the city of Atlanta offering to build them a stadium. And collectively, those are the things which lured Milwaukee's ownership to Atlanta.
We have Tommy from Kirkland and Rick from Stone Mountain, Georgia. And so, what other thoughts do you have? What other thoughts do you have about your book that you could share, insights that you came up with from your research?
Sure. I mean, in many ways, the book tells the story of the city, what's going on economically, what's going on politically, what's going on socially in the time period. And to a great extent, it's a story of the suburbanization of the region. And in many ways, it's the lack of support that a lot of the teams received was in part because it became such a widely decentralized region that it was tough to get into the cities for games. If you lived out, 30, 40 miles outside of the city, suddenly the idea of coming in on a summer night to sweat it out in the bleachers seemed a lot less appealing to people who could afford to go than, say, going boating or golfing or having a picnic with your family. In many ways, it didn't initially seem like a very family-friendly activity. Major League Baseball as a whole didn't draw as well in the 60s and 70s. So there's certainly that social dynamic of it as well. But I also go into great detail about the early history of each of the 4 franchises, the Hawks, the Flames, the Braves, and the Falcons, all of whom to some extent suffer from some management issues, with the actual exception of the Flames. The Flames early on, particularly when it came to their general manager, Cliff Fletcher, were a very well-run organization. They realized that nobody in Atlanta knew anything about hockey, so they could really build from the ground up with genuine prospects, as opposed to trying to bring in a name to draw people in. So Cliff Fletcher, who had been the assistant GM in Montreal, really poached a lot of talent from the Canadiens minor league system, which was incredibly fruitful at the time, and used that to build a very successful team. Public memory of the Flames is kind of strange. A lot of people look back and think they were kind of a joke or something. They certainly weren't. They made the playoffs in 6 of their 8 seasons, back when it really meant something to be in the playoffs. They drew above average in attendance in 5 of their 8 years. And for many years in the 1970s, it was the premier kind of upscale date night in metropolitan Atlanta to bring your date to a Flames game. There was really nothing else like it in the region. And the Flames were a very popular team for a period of time. Their relocation had as much to do with their owner's financial issues related to his downtown real estate empire as it did with the team's particular success. Tom Cousins, the owner of the Flames, received an excellent offer from businessmen in Calgary to relocate the franchise, paying him nearly 10 times as much as he initially paid for the team to join the league only 8 years after he bought the franchise. So the price was just too good to pass up. Now, the Falcons losing the 2016 Super Bowl and having a big league, and has there been any effect on the spirit of Atlanta from that? Have they recovered from that? What's the legacy of that Super Bowl? I think that's always going to be part of the legacy of Atlanta sports. I think most Atlanta sports fans looked at it and thought, here we go again. This is the same old Atlanta teams. Obviously, there's many examples of Atlanta teams, blowing it in the playoffs, as I think any city that has this range of teams, that's going to be true to some extent everywhere. I mean, Atlanta certainly has some notable examples, and that's probably the most notable one now because it was on the grandest of stages. But I think most Atlanta sports fans look at it that they've won so few championships. I mean, they have the Braves championship. They have a championship in MLS, which is kind of a different thing, to be frank. But I think a lot of Atlanta sports fans just viewed that as an exaggeration of the already existing narrative of pro sports in the city. Oh, this is Atlanta again. The Braves played in 5 World Series in the 90s. They lost 4 out of 5, and
and in '96 they were looking for go to back-to-back, and they won the first two at New York and lost the next four, and then they got swept in '99. What's the result of that experience of losing 4 out of 5 World Series? Does it haunt the city, or do they feel proud of winning in '95?
I think a certain apathy came into Atlanta with the Braves over time. I think that's changed a little bit. This current iteration of the Braves, which has been very successful in recent years, has tended to draw well at their new stadium, which has changed names a couple of times already out in Cobb County. But in recent times, they've been doing well. I think, though, over the course of winning, I believe it was 14 out of 15 division titles, and having the team show such futility in the playoffs, people just kind of started to be ho-hum about the teams, particularly in the postseasons. By the late 90s, oftentimes in the playoffs, you would see 8, 10, 12,000 empty seats at Turner Field for a playoff game, things you didn't see other places. But because Atlanta was there every single year, because they were so consistently excellent, people, I think started to lose interest a little bit. In my mind, it's almost a parallel to the Boston Celtics in the 60s. I mean, people think of the Celtics having great fans historically and stuff, but I lived in Boston for many years, and I spoke with many people who were in Boston in the time period who would speak of being able to walk up and get a good seat for a playoff game with the Celtics if it wasn't the finals, because people had become so used to them winning. So I think in many ways there's a certain curse to being such a successful franchise that it's tough to continue to be the kind of tie that binds that you are when you're first successful. So I think that's really the legacy of it. And it's unfortunate. Those were great teams. In a sense, they were a dynasty, at least a National League dynasty, and certainly an NL East one. But although initially I guess they were in the NL West until '94. But yeah, I think a certain apathy came over the fan base over time.
In 2015, the Hawks had a winning percentage of .732. I think that was the best in the NBA. They got swept in the East Finals by Cleveland. Any thoughts on that? The effect on that on the city?
Well, I think in some ways the Hawks have had an interesting history. I mean, their support was very poor early on for a bunch of different reasons, including even though they had Pete Maravich, though they had a new arena, they just really didn't catch on. I mean, one change that certainly happened in Atlanta that led to an expansion of their fan base was in the 1970s, 1980s. You see a significant expansion of Atlanta's African-American middle class, many of whom were basketball fans. When many people in this community could afford to go to games more regularly, Atlanta's fan base expanded, their live fan base expanded dramatically. And the Hawks ever since then have had fairly good attendance most of the time. That 2015 team was really the pulse of the city, though. They really brought people together and was a very exciting, successful team. And in many ways, the success they've had in the last season or two, I think, has been an extension of that enthusiasm. So Atlanta has had a fairly steady basketball fan base since the 80s, the Air Force One, Dominique Wilkins, Spud Webb, Doc Rivers era.
Now, since you've gotten into this whole history of sports teams and getting cities getting teams, in your crystal ball, what do you see? It sounds like you've looked at this nationally. What do you see going into the future? How much more movement will there be of teams, and what do you see coming?
Well, I have several chapters that are basically national in orientation, talking about how this whole broad phenomenon has happened, what facilitated it. I think team relocations are going to continue to exist and be a not uncommon phenomenon as long as, one, taxpayers are willing to pay for stadiums, two, the leagues have a monopoly on who can be members of the league, can decide where team members are, and limit the number of possible teams. As long as it is a limited and valuable commodity controlled by the leagues, in which only a limited number of cities can have it, even though many, many more cities could potentially support teams, there will be franchise relocations. In terms of expansion, it'll be interesting to see how that works. In many ways, expansion has slowed in the last decade or two. I mean, there was different leagues had rapid expansion at different points. Obviously, Major League Baseball in the 60s and 70s. The NHL had rapid expansion during that time period. The NBA expanded more a little bit later. And the NFL was pretty steady through. I mean, obviously doubled in size with the merger of the AFL and NFL, and has from time to time expanded since then. I kind of wonder, though, how much more these leagues will expand, just in having a sense of, I guess, developing a fan base who is broadly familiar enough with the league to retain interest in what's going on in all parts of it. I think particularly with baseball, with having such a long season, it's tough for fans to know outside of what's happening to their team in their division. I mean, I'm a Red Sox fan. You know, I really couldn't tell you what's happening in the National League West other than like kind of what the standings are in a vague sense. So I question how much more they will expand, and I think that will lead to franchise relocations becoming, or I guess remaining a common phenomenon in leagues, as long as cities want them. There was a 1998 study in the New York Times which suggested that 47 cities could hypothetically support a Major League Baseball team, or 47 metropolitan areas, and there were only 30 teams at the time. So there are obviously quite a few floating markets out there that could support teams if so inclined.
Our author is Clayton Trutor, author of Loserville, Atlanta Sports History book, coming out in February of 2022. The number to call if you'd like to ask a question for Clayton is 347-205-9631. Now, Clayton, can you talk about your own experience as a sports fan from the time you started following? It sounds like you were a Boston sports fan.
Yeah, I grew up in Vermont, and in general, the Boston teams are the teams people support here, with historically the exception of the Giants, though. Until the Patriots started winning Super Bowls, this was Giants country. And part of the reason is that there's a small Catholic college called St. Michael's College where the Giants used to do their summer training in the 50s and 60s. So I think the Giants retained a fan base as a result of that in the area. But I was a fan of neither of those teams. I'm a New York Jets fan. My mom loved Joe Namath, and my mom is who really taught me about sports. So I just followed the team she followed, which would be the three Boston teams and then the Jets. In terms of my interest in Atlanta, I really had no connection to Atlanta whatsoever going into the project. I was just going to pick a city that really served the story I was trying to tell. I mean, I've developed a certain affection for the city. I mean, the people in Atlanta have been incredibly welcoming and helpful to me in terms of learning about their community and helping research the project. And also, if you spend enough time with teams, you develop a certain affection for them. And I guess I have, particularly the teams that weren't quite as successful in the city. I think, particularly as a New York Jets fan, I think you appreciate winning more if your team doesn't win very often. So if the Jets have like a 9-7 season, I'm reacting like they're the 72 Dolphins or something. So I think that's colored my sports fandom quite a bit as well. I also do a fair amount of freelance writing, which tend to be feature stories for city and regional magazines about sports figures. They tend to be human interest type stories about retired athletes. So I guess that would be my other area of interest as well.
What was your first year as a sports fan?
I'm 40. 1988 is the first year where I remember from beginning to the end of the year following sports. I remember the Winter Olympics well in 1988 in Calgary. Growing up near the Canadian border, we watched a lot of Canadian television, so I was, very familiar with them, getting pumped up to watch it. I have firm recollections of the baseball season as a Red Sox fan. They won the AL East that year. I'm a little too young to remember the 86 season well. I have very faint recollections of certain things from the year, but in terms of remembering the whole season, 1988 is the first year. But ever since I was little, I've been interested in baseball history. I've just loved documentaries of all the major sports, and I've been as interested in the past of sports as much as I've been interested in the present throughout my fandom.
What do the 2004 Red Sox mean to you?
That's a funny thing. Like, in some ways, I guess my baseball fandom was more about. I mean, I'm glad they won the World Series, and I'm glad they've been so successful. With the Red Sox winning so often, I feel like they're less mine than they were before. I mean, there was a hardcore fan base, obviously, and a large fan base for the Red Sox. But once they started winning championship after championship, they sort of became something that everybody embraced. And I felt like they were a little bit a smaller thing, a little bit more mine before that. I mean, to me, what I love about baseball the most is just the day-to-day following a team throughout the season, following in many ways almost like the rhythms of the calendar. And that's what I love about baseball. Just you lose one night, you dust yourself off, you come back the next night and watch it. So in some ways, I'm also a huge football fan, so in some ways the postseason in baseball seemed like a bit of an annoyance to me, actually probably preferring football to baseball. So I've wrestled with those different things. So I've always just been more of a regular season guy in baseball. I love just listening or, when I'm driving around or listening on the radio in the backyard or watching the games just every night all summer long.
Well, I have similar thoughts as your mother regarding Joe Namath, although I wasn't a Jets fan, but to me he was like the coolest guy in the world, because although I don't think I was following the NFL in '69, but what are your thoughts on Joe Namath?
I think he was just such a fantastic entertainer. He brought a degree of showbiz to sports, which I think for better or for worse. Namath in many ways brings a celebrity quality to sports that I think had only rarely existed before that. And I think also in terms of players being able to negotiate for compensation that befit their skills and their draw, he was certainly on the cutting edge of that. I'm all for athletes getting out there and trying to get their market value, and Namath certainly did that well ahead of many people.
And how about the '08 Celtics?
I don't love the whole kind of we're going to build an all-star team on each franchise kind of thing. And I love the Celtics. It just sort of happened. It seemed like it was happening overnight that they had all these superstars. They went from being a terrible team to being a great team. I enjoyed the run. I found all of the main guys in the team interesting, but I remember the late '80s Celtics and enjoyed watching those teams to a greater extent. It may have been because I was younger and they seemed more like heroes to me, whereas I was roughly the same age as the guys in the Celtics at that point. But I certainly loved beating the Lakers in the finals.
One of my favorite quotes was Kevin Garnett after they won, and he turned his head facing the ceiling, and he yelled, anything is possible. And that's one of the quotes that I loved. I love to because it's kind of like Tug McGraw, and you got to believe, and this positive thinking, that believe you can achieve things. So I always loved that.
Absolutely. I was a Ray Allen guy. I just loved the quiet, steady performer, and he was just so consistent. He just seemed like such a consummate professional to me. And I think whether one is involved with sports or anything that they're pursuing, just having a commitment to everyday excellence like that is something I greatly admire. And I've always found Ray Allen to be a role model in that respect.
And I think the Red Sox have won, correct me if I'm wrong, 4 World Series, including '04.
4 World Series, yep.
So,
yep.
Which is interesting. Okay, now you got those 4, which is a lot considering they didn't have any. And then, what do people think about the '86 Red Sox? I imagine that's still a beloved team.
Absolutely. The thing is, there's a whole generation of fans who don't recall it at this point. I'm barely old enough to remember it. Until '04, it was the defining feature of being a contemporary Red Sox fan. Things have changed since then. I always felt like Bill Buckner got a really bad rap. He had bad ankles, bad knees, bad shins. McNamara shouldn't have had him in the game at that point and put him in a really bad position. And I've always felt badly that he, took such crap for that for so many years. I think the idea that somehow this redeemed Bill Buckner, I think that's silly. He didn't need redeeming in the first place. There's a real divide in the Red Sox fan base between the Johnny-come-latelys and then the people who followed the team through thick and thin before that.
Well, I was one of the guys rooting hard for the Red Sox in '04, and I think it was maybe the year before when Pedro Martinez was pitching in Yankee Stadium, and there's chanting "Who's your daddy?" and I was just I was horrified by that because I was stressed out, wanting the Red Sox to win. But anyway, the time has flown by. Our guest has been Mr. Clayton Trutor, author of Loserville, Atlanta Sports History, coming out in February of next year. Clayton, do you have any final words for our audience?
Yeah, I'd love for them to come check me out on Facebook or on Twitter. My name is at ClaytonTrutor on Twitter. I'd love for them to check out my new book, Loserville, How Professional Sports Remade Atlanta and How Atlanta Remade Professional Sports. I view it as being an origin story for the modern sports business as a whole. It's from the University of Nebraska Press, which is the nation's top publisher of sports history books, and is available for pre-order on all the well-known book websites. And I look forward to you guys reading it. I look forward to discussing it with anybody who takes the time to read it. I'm genuinely appreciative of it, and I'm appreciative of your time as well tonight. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I'm appreciative of people like you who write books, sports books, because it's just tremendous. Because I know it takes an awful lot of work, and people enjoy it. And you just sit down and read it. It's something easy to do. But the guy who wrote it worked hard, did a lot of hard work. So that's just tremendous. Again,
it was a decade of my life. Yep.
What's that?
I spent a decade working on it, so I mean.
A decade, okay. There you go. That's what I was thinking. So that's inspiring and just tremendous. I take my hat off to you, and thank you so much, Clayton, for coming on the show. It's wonderful having you.
It was a genuine pleasure. I hope you have a nice evening.
I will do that, and I hope you do as well. Dear listener, may the road rise to meet you. May the wind be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Good night, everybody. Thanks again, Mr. Clayton Trutor.
Thank you.